If it's anti-Russian, it is Nazi. And that is how they're talking about it here. They see independence, separation from the brotherly nation, the brotherly Slavic nation of Russia. That's Nazi, because it's in their minds anti-Russian. This is Nazi. So I wanted to read this article here, which is an old piece. This is not something that was released recently. It is from the Kremlin mouthpiece, is how New Voice of Ukraine refers to it. But basically, it's Russian state media from RIA who published an article in April, about a month and a half into the war, where the person writing this article on a state-funded and state-managed news outlet said some pretty fascist things about Ukraine, said some pretty horrible things about Ukraine, and I wanted to show you guys some of the rhetoric that has been going on since the very start of the 2022 invasion, because I think it's important to pull back the blinds on what's being said inside of Russia to understand how Russian soldiers can go into locations like Bucha and massacre everybody, go to places like Izium and create the largest mass grave since the Yugoslav genocides. It's hard to imagine somebody garnering a mentality that would lead to such horrific atrocities that have been reported. The castrations of Ukrainian POWs, beheadings, murdering their own comrades in arms with sledgehammers. And so I wanted to look into the propaganda, the ideological foundation that underpins this type of brutality, savagery, and barbarism. So I wanted to read this RIA article from earlier in the now I do want to read the editor's note, because I know some people with New Voice of Ukraine, Anthony Barteret, Roman, good people. So I want to make sure that the editor's note gets read at the start. Editor's note: the original manifesto was published in April. New Voice is republishing it now to counter the existing Russian propaganda narrative that if Ukraine stopped fighting Russia, Russia would not kill anyone in Ukraine. The article is a piece of Russian propaganda aimed at spreading hatred against Ukrainians, labeling the entire nation of Russia, the nation enemies of Russia that deserves ethnic cleansing under Russian control. Editorial note: our editorial team debated whether it was worth publishing this article, as we did not want to give a platform to what we see as what is essentially a Russian fascist manifesto promulgating hate against Ukrainians. However, we decided that it is in the interest of alerting the world to the depths to which Russia has already sunk into fascism, and to provide evidence for further cases in international courts of the Kremlin's intention to carry out ethnic cleansing in Ukraine. We would publish this piece, albeit with the disclaimer and annotations within the text, noting its most egregious falsehoods. Okay, so the title of the article is What Russia Should Do in Ukraine. What Russia should do with Ukraine. Okay, let's read. Back in April of last year, this is in reference to April of 2021, we wrote about the inevitability of Ukraine's denazification. We don't need the Nazi Banderite Ukraine as an enemy of Russia and as an instrument of the West to destroy Russia. Today, the question of denazification has come into the practical world. This is in reference to the invasion. Denazification is necessary when a sizable part of the population, most likely the majority, has mastered and drawn in the Nazi regime into its politics. Now they put a fact check here, and I do think this is a notable fact check. I'm not going to read all the fact checks. I just don't think they're all necessary. But for this one, it is necessary because it's noting that the most far-right parties in Ukraine, we're talking about Svoboda, talking about maybe right sectors, political wing, the national cores, they united, and I'm not even including all the parties. They went into like a nationalist bloc together, and they failed to get to 5% of the vote to enter parliament. So if they were unable to enter parliament, it's hard to imagine that if the most far-right elements of Ukrainian society, including many of those elements are not even going to be Nazis themselves, by the way, but the most far-right elements of Ukrainian politics can't even enter parliament in a free and fair election, it's hard to imagine that the majority of Ukrainians have welcomed Nazism into their heart. Definitely when the last election was dominated by, a Jewish candidate. That is when the theory, the people are good, the government is bad, no longer holds true. Admitting this fact is that basically what they're saying is The idea that this is the Ukrainian government's fault solely is wrong. The Ukrainian people themselves are also at fault. The Ukrainian government's bad, and the Ukrainian people are bad. Like a bad egg. That's what we're getting here. Omitting the fact is the basis of the denazification policy. All of its assorted measures, and the fact itself is the subject matter of the policy. Ukraine finds itself in exactly this situation. The fact that the Ukrainian electorate chose Poroshenko's peace and Zelensky's peace should not mislead. Ukrainians are quite satisfied with the shortest path to peace through blitzkrieg, which the last two Ukrainian presidents transparently hinted at when they were elected. It was this method of appeasement of internal anti-fascists through total terror that was used in Odessa, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other Russian cities. Notice here that all these cities are Russian cities. Mariupol is not seen as a Ukrainian city. None of these cities is seen as a Ukrainian city. I've gone to Kharkiv. The majority of people do not identify as Russian, as in members of the Russian government, members of the Russian state, members of the country of Russia. They view themselves as Ukrainians. Many of them, if not most of the people I know in these areas, primarily speak Russian. But just because you speak Russian does not mean you consider yourself part of Russia. And this completely satisfied the Ukrainian layman. Denazification is a system of measures related to the Nazification of a mass portion of the population, which cannot technically be subject to direct punishment as war criminals. Nazis who take up arms have to be maximally eradicated from the battlefield. There's no, man, this did not pan out for them, huh? There's no need to derive a difference between the armed forces of Ukraine and the so-called national battalions, as well as the territorial defense forces that has joined these types of military formations. They're all involved in extreme cruelty against the civilian population, all equally responsible for the genocide of the Russian population, and who do not follow the laws and customs of war. Okay, so first off, this is really interesting because their argument is that every single person that picks up a gun in defense of the Ukrainian nation is equally guilty of war crimes and genocide against the Russians, even though many of the people they will be talking about, for example, the territorial defense guys I filmed with in Zaporozhye, they're going to be Russian speakers themselves. They're going to be the people that they said that they invaded to liberate from the Ukrainian government. But those people are now guilty of genociding themselves, according to the Russian government. Even if they're just territorial defense, which I'm going to be honest with you, definitely early on in the war, territorial defense, a lot of it was, hi, my village is about to be run over. I would very much not like the Russians to come in and murder my wife and daughter. I'm going to pick up a gun and defend my village. That person to them committed genocide by picking up a gun and therefore need to be eradicated. All of them, maximally eradicated. The standing armed forces of Ukraine need to be wiped off the face of the earth. They're all equally guilty of genocide. By the way, the UN Inspector General has stated clearly that there is no evidence of genocide going on in the Donbass, which is what they're referring to here. The only thing you can maybe talk about is like language laws that specifically restrict the use of the Russian language in public buildings, meaning that if you go into a public building and you say something like let's say it's like a police station, the people at the desk would maybe talk to you first in Ukrainian, and then when you speak Russian, they switch over to Russian, right? Now, you can disagree with that law, but that's not genocide, and it's really whittling down what the word genocide means. Anyway, let's continue. War criminals and active Nazis have to be made an example of. There has to be total lustration, the liquidation and ban of any organization that ties themselves to the practice of Nazism. The thing that's scary about this too is many of in Russian media, a lot of times the basic display of Ukrainian identity can be equated to Nazism. For example, Slava Ukraini, Herom Slava. This is a phrase that is often called a Nazi phrase by Russian state media and many people who are extremely sympathetic to the Russian occupiers. But the history of this phrase goes back before when the Nazi party was even founded. We're talking about like the People's Republic of Ukraine. The origins of this phrase come from. But because the UPA at one point touched it, or because it was deeply tied to Ukrainian national identity, and the Russian government denies the Ukrainian national identity as something that was just made up as an anti-Russian language and anti-Russian identity, a lot of times just the basic practice of being Ukrainian can be enough to be like, oh, that's Nazism. That's this horrible, horrible thing. We need to do away with it. This is anti-Slavic. This is anti-Russian. It needs to be done away with. However, aside from the leadership, a good part of the population is also responsible here, who are themselves passive Nazis, accomplices to Nazism. They supported the Nazi government and indulged it. Again, they're referring to a government led by a Jew whose family survived the Holocaust. A government which also, when it comes to the text of the law, banned the Nazi symbols. Both Soviet and Nazi symbols being publicly displayed. I wish a lot of times these laws were maybe pushed a little bit more on the type of stuff that's posted on the territorial defenses pages, like Totenkopfs and stuff like that, that of course is not the majority, but that pops up there. But that's like the closest you can get to anything Nazi related when you're talking about the Ukrainian government and actually representing Nazi values, is symbology amongst a very small percentage of its armed forces. We're saying that a Nazi government in 2015 passed legislation to protect LGBTQ plus people from workplace discrimination. A Nazi government is right now having legislation go through its LADA about legalizing civil unions between LGBTQ plus people, men and men, women and women. This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's a milquetoast Nazi. A just punishment for this part of the population. By the way, can I just say, modern Russia's position on homosexuality is closer to Nazi Germany's position on homosexuality as a modern state, as we see the Russian government trying to ban transition, going after literature and media that represents LGBTQ plus people, going out and arresting people for posting about the LGBTQ plus community prominently, stopping protests, pro-LGBTQ plus protests. That's a lot closer to what Nazi Germany's position on homosexuals was than what the Ukrainian government's position, which is still bad, by the way, but not even close to the same. A just punishment for this part of the population can only be found in the burden of the hardships of a just war against the Nazi system. The just punishment of this part of the population is possible. By the way, I thought they were going to Ukraine to liberate it. And now this is just like, we need to punish the population. We need to punish this Nazi population. We're all complicit in genocide of us. Because what the picture that's being painted of the Ukrainian nation state is the same picture that was painted correctly, mind you, of Nazi Germany during World War II. And so then when the Soviet soldiers went into Nazi Germany, knowing what the Nazis did in their villages and towns, the Soviet soldiers did not treat the civilian population kindly. They did, it was called the rape of Berlin for a reason. And so if your mindset going into this war is, we're fighting people genociding me, we're fighting people slaughtering me, even though Russia's fine. Russia's, has a lot of areas that are dilapidated and there's a lot of issues in Russia's, but Russia's not getting invaded. So this thing that they're conducting war crimes in a lot of instances and revenge for isn't even fucking real. But if that image is in your head of the person I am attacking right here is the Nazi, the same people my ancestors had to fight, it's not that hard to imagine how their mentality gets to, war crimes. This punishment of the population is possible only as bearing the inevitable hardships of a just war against the Nazi system, carried out with the utmost care and discretion with respect to civilians. The further denazification of this part of the population is composed of re-education, which should reach ideological repression of Nazi attitudes and strict censorship, not only in the political sphere, but absolutely as well in the spheres of culture and education. It's precisely through culture and education that the plan to deeply Nazify a mass population was prepared and carried out, strengthened by the promises of spoils from the victory of the Nazi regime over Russia, Nazi propaganda, internal violence and terrorism, as well as 8 years of Ukrainian Nazis against the insurgent people of the Donbass. So, first off, re-education camps, re-education facilities, talking about brainwashing on a mass scale. The Ukrainian people hate us, so we need to force them to love us in response to them wanting to be an independent state that is not subservient to the interests of the Russian government. That's the first thing. Strict censorship. So suppressing the press so they don't, for example, criticize Vladimir Putin. That would be very Nazi of them. Suppressing the press so they don't, for example, practice the Ukrainian culture a little too loudly. You know, you got to make sure you clamp down on that. Suppression of the press to make sure they don't criticize Wagner for its horrific atrocities and openly talk about the massacres in Bucha and the massacres in Izium and all the war crimes being done by the Russians, because that's Nazi propaganda. But they're also talking about it in the spheres of culture and education. Censorship in the spheres of culture and education. What would that mean? Well, it would most likely mean the erasure of a lot of Soviet atrocities against the Ukrainian state, a lot of erasure of a lot of the Soviet atrocities against Crimean Tatars, of Russian Empire's atrocities against the Ukrainian people. What could this mean? I mean, they leave it up to interpretation, but considering the leanings of the article writer and the way they're talking about it, the way they would teach Russian and Ukrainian history in these schools makes me think it would be very similar to how the Japanese talk about the Asian co-prosperity sphere during a Japanese imperial rule of China. It's precisely through culture and education that the plan to deeply Nazify a massive population... Okay, I already read it. The denazification can only be conducted by the victor, which assumes 1, its unconditional control over the denazification process, and 2, the authority that can facilitate this control. In this respect, a country undergoing denazification cannot be sovereign. The denazification leading government, Russia, cannot proceed from a liberal approach regarding denazification. Okay, number 1, they're saying that Russia should be the only person that controls Ukraine. It has to be uncontested. So the UN and other dumb liberal organizations, get the fuck out. This is Russia's house. They're going to do what they want. Number 2, an authority can facilitate this control. In this respect, the country undergoing denazification cannot be sovereign, meaning no democratically elected government. The Ukrainians don't have a say in the matter. The Ukrainians are not a sovereign people. They are subservient to the quote-unquote denazification process. Therefore, Russia is going to have uncontested control, not hindered either by international organizations, other nation states, concerned third parties, or the Ukrainian people themselves. The ideology of the denazifying party cannot be disrupted by the guilty party, subjected to denazification. Okay, so this is them spelling it out explicitly, that the Ukrainian people's concerns are not of interest. Russia's call for the necessity, he's saying that not only is this wanted, but this is a necessity. It is like built in. Russia has to control all of Ukraine and control its future without their say. It's a necessity. The Russia's call for the necessity of denazification means that the Crimean scenario cannot work for Ukraine as a whole. In fact, this scenario was already unrealistic in 2014 and in the rebellious Donbass. Basically, they're saying that the takeover of Crimea was too nice for the rest of Ukraine. They would have to be a lot more aggressive. Only 8 years of resistance to Nazi violence and terrorism has led to internal cohesion and consciousness, unambiguous mass refusal to maintain any unity and connection with Ukraine, which defined itself as a Nazi society. By the way, there is a holiday in Ukraine specifically celebrating victory over Nazism. I just want to throw that out there. And Zelensky himself celebrated it like a month or two ago. The duration of this denazification could not take less than a single generation, which has to be born, grown up, and mature in the conditions of denazification. Denazification of Ukraine took more than 30 years, starting at a minimum in 1989, when Ukrainian nationalism receives a legal and legitimate form of political self-expression and spearheaded the movement for quote-unquote independence, leading towards Nazism. You can see here a direct tie between the idea that Ukraine is independent, the idea that Ukraine is separate from Russia, is inherently tied to Nazism. This shows, again, and I've talked about this before, that a lot of the ways that how Nazism is viewed in Russia isn't as like anti-Jewish or anti-gay, anti-LGBT, but it's primarily focused on it being anti-Slav, or more focused, if we're digging deeper, anti-Russian. If it's anti-Russian, it is Nazi. And that is how they're talking about it here. They see independence, separation from the brotherly nation, the brotherly Slavic nation of Russia. That's Nazi, because it's in their minds anti-Russian. This is Nazi. And it's that basic to it. It's not that complicated. That's how they can get around the idea of Zelensky being the one to lead the modern Nazi state. That's how they can get around the idea that Ukraine also celebrates victory over Nazism. That's how they get around the low popularity of the far-right parties. That's how they maneuver around it. A particular feature of Nazified Ukraine is its amorphous and ambivalentness, which allows for the masking of Nazism as the desires to move towards an independent and European, and then they put in parentheses, Western and pro-American, right? So to them, if Ukraine is independent or away from Russia or separate from Russia, they're Western, they're pro-American, and that path of development is, terrible for them, terrible for us. We need to choose you the correct path. In reality, towards degradation, while insisting Ukraine doesn't have any Nazism, only private and singular excesses. There isn't, after all, a single important Nazi party. No Führer, no fully racist laws, only their curtailed variants in the form of repression against the Russian language. As a result, there is no opposition and resistance to the regime. However, all of the above does not make Ukrainian Nazism a light version of German Nazism circa the first half of the 20th century. On the contrary, seen as Ukrainian Nazism is freed from the similar typical political, technological by nature, boundaries and restrictions, it can freely unfold as a fundamental basis for all types of Nazism, as a European and in rather developmental form of American racism. That's why denazification cannot be conducted in a compromise fashion on the basis of formulas like NATO no, the EU yes. Okay, so this is mostly gibberish. I'm going to be honest. This is mostly gibberish. It almost sounds like they're trying to say that this is as bad as German Nazism or worse than German Nazism. If you read here, where is it again? On the contrary, seen as Ukrainian Nazism is freed from the similar boundaries and restrictions, it can freely unfold as a fundamental basis for all types of Nazism. A fundamental basis for all types of Nazism, led by a Jewish nation implementing LGBTQ plus protections at a slow rate, but doing it so. This is just gibberish. This isn't like, oh, well, let me show you their Nazi values. They believe in anti-Semitism. They believe in all this ultranationalism. They believe in, all of that. They're not doing any of that. They're very, anti-labor, and they're like targeting any independent labor union. And it's like Russia would care about any of that stuff or any of those values of Nazism or those values of Nazi or fascist governments. None of that matters. It's anti-Russian. It is Nazi. Kill the Nazi. The collective West is itself a designer, source, and sponsor of Ukrainian Nazism. At the time, the Western Bandera cadres and their historical memory were only one of the tools for the Nazification of Ukraine. Ukranazism is not a smaller, but in fact larger threat to the world and Russia than even German Nazism of the Hitlerian version. Here it is. This shows how unbelievably deluded this is. Their argument, and I saw it kind of eking up earlier, and I talked about it then, but you could see the argument here. It is not smaller, but a larger threat to the world than Hitler. Zelensky is a larger threat to the world than Hitler and German Nazism, which killed over 6 million Jews and led to the deaths of 60 to 80 million people. This not only is stupid, because they haven't built the groundwork to show like Ukraine's Nazi values, the values of its government, how the majority of their people like believe in these Nazi values, because he's not just advocating for tearing down the Ukrainian government, he's advocating for tearing down the Ukrainian people. He is saying that not only the government is bad, but the people of the Ukrainian nation state, which has rejected brother Russia, they are bad. They are bad. That was one of the things they opened this with. And so they are arguing that they're all bad. They did none of the legwork to prove that fact, to argue how they're Nazis. It was mostly just historical gibberish. And now they've made the jump from historical gibberish to, and therefore the Ukrainians are worse than Hitler. The Ukrainians are worse than the German Nazis. By the way, the Germans invaded Poland. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The Germans invaded France. The Ukrainians didn't invade Russia, either in 2014 or in 2022. But somehow it is a bigger threat to the world than Hitler. Who is Ukraine going to invade? What was Ukraine's invasion plans? There isn't any book published by Zelensky where he's like clearly laying out his evil, anti-Semitic, insidious ideology where he's going to tear down Europe and rebuild it in Germany's image, or in Ukraine's image. This isn't a thing that's happening. It's just completely deluded. It is trying to paint Ukraine as the most dangerous entity, not only as a nation state, but as a people, that the Ukrainians as a people are dangerous, and that we are facing a bigger threat than what their ancestors, and this is disrespectful, by the way. This is like they're pissing on the graves of those Russians who died during the Great Patriotic War. That's the word they use, of course, by saying this. The idea that Ukraine and Zelensky's government is a bigger threat than them. They have to bring it up to cartoonish levels to convince anyone to go to Ukraine and die in the mud. The name Ukraine seemingly cannot be retained as the title of any fully denazified state entity in a territory liberated from the Nazi regime. The People's Republics newly created in the space free from Nazism should and will grow from the practice of economic self-government and social security, and the restoration and modernization of social support systems for the population. So this is talking about not only, all these different oblasts in Ukraine will get used to being integrated with Russia, but that Ukraine as an entity will cease to exist. That Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian nation state, and the idea that they could self-govern themselves, that will be erased from the map by the Russian government, or should be erased from the map by the Russian government, again, from a state-run news outlet. The political aspirations cannot, in fact, be neutral. Their atonement to Russia, not Russia's atonement to Ukraine for their crimes, the Ukrainian people's atonement to Russia for wanting to be their own country, apparently. They haven't really described their many crimes so far. I think one of them was genocide, which the UN still has yet to find evidence of. But Ukraine's atonement to Russia for their attitude towards her. What a crazy sentence. They're invading a country, and the best thing you can come up with for what the country you're invading has to atone for is their attitude towards Russia. They can't say they atone for their invasion of Russia or anything like that, because it doesn't exist. So it's atone to Russia for their attitude towards her as an enemy can only be achieved by relying on Russia in the process of restoration, revival, and development. No Marshall Plan for these territories can be allowed. No neutrality in any ideological or practical sense, concurrently with denazification, can be allowed. cadres and organizations that serve as instruments of denazification in the newly denazified republics can only rely on the direct power and organizational support of Russia. Okay, so everything that they just said here is just a description of colonialism. They're saying that Ukraine, in order to atone for the sin of wanting to be its own thing, will have to completely rely on Russia, have to rely on them for development and control and everything, for rebuilding their country in their newly ideologically pure oblasts within Russia. This newly reunited territory with Russia, the only way that they will be able to function is as an extension of the Russian state, solely dependent on the Russian state. So this is a colonial mindset that they must depend on them, they must buy resources from them, they must become an extension of the Russian state. This is just the description of colonialism. Denazification will inevitably be expressed as de-Ukrainianization. Again, this is where we're talking about ethnic cleansing. This is when we're talking about the question of genocide. De-Ukrainianization is the erasure of an ethnic group. That is what he is describing right here. He's now going to describe the erasure of an ethnic group, or what would be talked about in many circles as actual genocide. The rejection of the artificially divided ethnic component of self-identification created as far back as under the Soviet authority of the population of the historical territories of Malorussia and Novorossiya. Novorossiya means Greater Russia. It's an imperial wet dream for Russian nationalists. Basically, they believe that Eastern Ukraine, but many of them believe all of Ukraine, belongs to Russia, and they can do whatever they want of it. It's Greater Russia. It's Russian ultra-nationalist bait, really. As an instrument of the communist superpower, this artificial ethnocentrism did not remain ownerless after its fall. In this official capacity, it passed to the authority of another superpower, a power that supersedes governments, the Western superpower. It's necessary to return it to its obvious borders and to limit its political functionality. So what it just called for here is de-Ukrainianization. This not only means the abolition of the Ukrainian nation state, because he moves on to say the rejection of artificially divided ethnic components of self-identification. This could mean culture, like song and dance. This would almost certainly mean control over their education, so they control what the future of Ukraine would be taught about their history, about their political figures, about their political liberation and then political occupation, and was almost certainly also mean control of their language, as in, you know, you're going to be learning Russian now. And from what we've heard from the Russian children that have been sent, not the Russian children, Ukrainian children that have come back after being in Russian captivity, many of them are not treated well when they stick out their neck and make sure to speak Ukrainian. Unlike, say, Georgia and the Baltic states, Ukraine, as history has shown, cannot exist in the form of a national government, and attempts to build it as such naturally leads to Nazism. This is exactly my point. This has been my point the whole thing. This right here is the argument. And I'm sorry, I'm just kind of repeating myself here, but it's, if you are Ukrainian in any way, culture, song, dance, identification, or Nazi state, or you know, nation state, it will inevitably lead to Nazism. To be Ukrainian is to be a Nazi. That is the argument here. This is an argument that precedes ethnic cleansing, cultural erasure, and genocide. To say that this ethnic group, as on its basic level, only exists as an enemy to your ethnic group. That is the type of rhetoric that precedes war crimes, mass murder, and mass graves being filled. And this was done in April of last year. This is when it was released. It was actually released the same day that mass graves are being uncovered that were filled by Russian soldiers. So if you want to get an idea of where those ideas could get into the head of Russian soldiers, this is the type of stuff they were reading. unlike, say, Georgia and the Baltic states, already said that, naturally leads to Nazism. Okay, so if you are Ukrainian, you by definition are a Nazi. Ukrainianism is an artificial anti-Russian construct, which does not have any civilizational content of its own, disregarding Ukrainian scientists, Ukrainian poets, Ukrainian language, any of the Ukrainian contributions to any number of sciences, which does not have any civilizational content of its own and is a subordinate element of foreign and alien civilization. Basically, they're saying that to be Ukrainian is Nazi, and to be Ukrainian is to be an American puppet. The Banderism is not, by itself, enough for denazification. The Banderite element is just one expression in a screen, a mask for the European project of a Nazi Ukraine, which is why the denazification of Ukraine is also its inevitable de-Europeanization. The Banderite leadership also has to be liquidated, as their re-education is impossible. The social swamp, which actively and passively supports it through action and inaction, has to survive the hardships of war and assimilate this experience as a historical lesson and atonement for its guilt. Those who did not support the Nazi regime, but suffered from it and the war unleashed by the Donbass, must be consolidated and organized, and must become the pillar of the new government. It's vertical and horizontal. Historical experience shows that the tragedies and dramas of wartime serve to help the population, tempted and carried away by their role as an enemy of Russia. Okay, so first off, this is basically saying they're going to kill everybody in the government. That if they capture Zelensky, they're going to hang him. If they capture Budanov or any other Ukrainian government official, they're going to kill him. That's at least what the article's arguing for. And the social swamp, which actively and passively supports it through action and inaction, has to survive so it can atone for its guilt. So probably show trials, something along those lines. Oh, and also it's saying that basically all of the Russian-aligned groups in the Donbass are going to be the center of power after the war. So, for example, I think it's, what's the guy, Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Push, that's his name. Yeah, Denis Pushilin. These type of guys, by the way, this guy is a con artist. He was actually involved in the MMM marketing scheme. Criminals, mostly. Mafia bosses, criminals, gang leaders. They're going to be the future political leadership of Ukraine under Russian occupation. Denazification, as a goal of the special military operation, within the scope of that operation, is understood as a military victory over the Kiev regime, the liberation of the territory from armed Nazi supporters, the liquidation of irreconcilable Nazis, the capture of war criminals, as well as the creation of a system of conditions for the following peacetime denazification. The latter, in turn, should begin with the organization of local self-government, law enforcement, and defense bodies, cleansed of Nazi elements. This can be used as a basis to launch the founding process of a new Republican statehood, integrating the statehood into close cooperation with the Russian Department of Ukrainian Denazification. Wow, they're going to create a whole department to erase the Ukrainian identity. Very good of them, very nice of them. Newly created or converted, say, from the I can't pronounce. This, along with the adoption under Russian control of a Republican regulatory framework on denazification, the definition of the boundaries and framework for the direct application of Russian law and Russian jurisdiction, the liberated territories in the field of denazification, and the creation of a tribunal for the crimes against humanity in the former Ukraine. Wow, the rapists, murderers, and marauders are going to be the ones holding the Human Rights Tribunal. In this regard, Russia should act as a guardian of the Nuremberg trial. Wow, man, when I think about the bravest prosecutors during the Nuremberg trials that brought the Nazis to justice, the first people I think of is the ones building up mass graves full of 440 bodies. All of the above means that in order to achieve the goals of denazification, it will be necessary to win the support of the people. Yeah, good luck with that. To get them on Russia's side after they're freed from the terror, violence, and ideological pressures of the Kiev regime, after getting them out of their informational isolation. By the way, Ukrainians can access most foreign press, if not all foreign press, unless it's like literal Russian state TV. Like they can access content like the New York Times, which identifies, for example, cluster munitions use by the Ukrainian military. That does not change their mind. I know there's a recent piece in the Intercept released about like narrative control that the Ukrainian government has tried to do when it comes to, you know, interacting with the international press. But the amount of information control in Russia, it like unbelievably pales in comparison. Unbelievably pales in comparison. The idea that if, you know, you just removed the information control, Ukraine would immediately reject its Ukrainian identity and become Russian is absolutely ridiculous. Ukrainians can go overseas and study. Ukrainians can go overseas and interact with other types of media. They can interact with that types of media in Ukraine right now, but just by going online. They can go on to New York Times and read that article about cluster munitions use by the Ukrainian army. That's from back in April. The real kicker is this is the thing that gets me, and it's funny, but it's not funny. In reality, what would have to happen for this to ever work, even though I don't think this would ever work, it's not easy to completely make a nation forget its culture, history, and people. Russia has been trying to do that to Ukrainians for a very long time. But in reality, in order for them to do this, they would have to do the exact opposite. They would not have to free Ukraine from an information bubble. They would have to capture Ukraine in an information bubble to make sure no Western news outlets or any anti-Russian occupational news outlets, underground or otherwise, would be unable to corrupt the people of Ukraine's mind to believe that they deserve sovereignty. It's understood that some time must pass for people to recover from the shock of military action and be convinced of Russia's long-term intention, and that they won't be abandoned. Yeah, that's the real issue between the Ukrainian people and Russia, is that they're scared the Russians will leave. That's the real fear. It's impossible to foresee where exactly, on what territories, this critical mass of the population will be found to make the necessary majority. The Catholic provinces, Western Ukraine and its 5 oblasts, is unlikely to join the group of pro-Russian territories. The line of separation, however, will be found through experienced routes. It will remain hostile to Russia, but will still be forcibly neutral in demilitarized Ukraine, with Nazism banned on formal grounds. Okay, so it's basically saying that some parts of Ukraine might just be too rebellious, too, Catholic or whatever. It's not able to be brought in line. So all we'll do is destroy its ability to resist us, and we'll just tell them that they can't really practice their identity that much anyway. But maybe they won't be integrated with the rest. That's where Russia haters will leave too. The guarantee that this last remaining bit of Ukraine would remain neutral should be the threat of immediate military operation if those stated requirements are not met. Man, the amount of demands and crazy shit that was being pumped out by the Russian state early on, in comparison to where the balance of power is right now, where the Russians are trying to hold back the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporozhye, just shows exactly how much the Ukrainians have overperformed from what the Russians and the international community expected. From the line of separation to the Russian border will be a territory that can potentially be integrated into Russian civilization, and anti-fascist in its own internal nature. The operation to denazify Ukraine, which has started with the military phase, follow in peacetime the same logic of progression as the military operation. With each step, it will be necessary to succeed in implementing irreversible changes, which would become the building blocks of the following step. For this, the necessary first steps of denazification begin defined in the following ways. The liquidation of the armed Nazi formations. By the way, and he says it here, this is all of the Ukrainian army. So all of them has to be liquidated, destroyed, as well as anything that assists their military, informational, and educational infrastructure. So this also means a complete breaking down of how the Ukrainians have managed their own education, its information space, etc. So the destruction of anything that could provide any resistance either culturally or militarily. The creation of bodies for popular self-rule as well as law enforcement. So on liberated territory to protect people from terrorist acts of insurgent Nazi groups. The implementation of the Russian information space. So this means controlling the information space, stopping the freedom of the press, stopping what they would call Nazi propaganda, or, maybe something that calls out Putin's corruption. The seizure of any education materials and a ban on educational programs at all levels that contain Nazi ideological attitudes. Basically anything that doesn't suck Russia's cock. Like, let's just be for real. Mass investigations to establish personal accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, spreading of Nazi ideology, and supporting the Nazi regime. You know what's funny about this? I wonder if Rusich, which is a Nazi militia that the Russians are using in Ukraine, I wonder if they would be put on trial for Nazi ideology. Probably not. Lustration, publicizing the names of the accomplices of the Nazi regime, engaging them in forced labor. Forced labor. So they're going to bring back the Gulag system. I'm sure the Ukrainians are eager for that. Forced labor to repair destroyed infrastructure as part of their punishment for Nazi activities. The adoption, for those that won't be sentenced to death. Okay, fantastic. So if you don't kill them, you put them to work. The adoption at a local level, under Russian advisement, primary normative acts of grassroots denazification, a ban of all types and forms of reviving Nazi ideology, the creation of memorials, commemorative signs, and monuments to the victims of Ukrainian Nazism, and the immortalization of the memory of the heroes that fought against it. So they're going to put the statues of the people who came to Ukraine to occupy it, of this war, in Ukraine. Could you imagine if the people who raped and murdered their way through Bucha and Izium got statues in Kiev? How unbelievably insulting that would be. Unbelievably insulting to the civilian population. The creation and adoption of a series of anti-fascist and denazification norms in the constitution of these new people's republics, and the creation of a constantly operating body of denazification for a period of 25 years. So this process will go on for at least 25 years. Russia will have no compatriots in its denazification of Ukraine, seen as this is a purely Russian work, as well as considering, so basically no UN, no international oversight, and of course nobody wants to assist them in their ethnic cleansing, as well as considering that it is not just a Banderite version of Nazi Ukraine that will be eradicated, but also, and most of all, Western totalitarianism, the forced programs of civilization degradation and ruin, the mechanisms of subjugation to the superpower of the West and the USA. In order to realize the plan of Ukrainian denazification, Russia itself will have to fully rid itself of its pro-European and pro-Western illusions and accept itself as the last line of defense and the preserver of these values of historic Europe, the old world. This all just like reeks of like fascist, like return to tradition. We are the last line of defense. The enemy is at the gates. We must brutalize the Ukrainians and punish them for their Nazi values. And by that we mean for being Ukrainian, because their very identity is anti-Russian, because they are not accepting our identity as their own. And just see, every word of this just seeps with fascism, which it deserves and from which the West has ultimately abandoned, losing in a war against itself. Man, the irony. The war stretched out for the entirety of the 20th century and was expressed in a world war and in the Russian Revolution, which are inextricably linked together. Russia has done all it can to save the West in the 20th century. Wow. Very nice of it. It helped implement the important Western project, an alternative capitalism, which won its nation states the Red Socialist Project. It destroyed German Nazism, a monstrous product of the crisis of Western civilization. I wonder if any of that could be that, the Soviet Union helped the Nazis split up Poland. I wonder if, they have any responsibility to that, or the fact that they kept shipping the Nazis resources up until the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, or the fact that they deported German communists to the Nazis to then be killed in the Holocaust. And then they told German communists across Europe to not resist. I mean, I wonder if any of this could, have enabled them at all. The last acre of Russian altruism was the hand of friendship offered by Russia, for which Russia received the horrific blow of the 1990s. Everything that Russia did for the West, it did out of its own pocket while making massive sacrifices. The West, in the end, rejected all of these sacrifices, devalued Russia's contribution to resolving the Western crisis, and decided to take revenge on Russia for the help that it had selflessly provided. I can't believe we would bully Russia like this. Now, Russia will go its own way without worrying about the fate of the West, drawing on the other part of its heritage, leading the global process of decolonization. My goodness, the irony of writing a big article of why we should colonize Ukraine, destroy its local identity, and make them all Russian because their identity is scary to me, and then end it with, look how much of an anti-colonialist superpower we are by practicing colonialism in Ukraine. My God, the fucking irony out here. It's off the charts, man. As a part of this process, Russia has a great potential to build partnerships and allied relationships with those countries that the West has oppressed for centuries and which will not again suffer under its yoke. Without Russian sacrifices, these nations would have not been liberated. Ukraine's denazification is at the same time its decolonization. Man, up is down, left is right, war is peace, huh? Which should be understood by the Ukrainian population as how it will begin to free itself from the intoxication, temptation, and dependence on its so-called European choice. I like that the whole article is arguing that they basically need to colonize Ukraine and that Ukraine needs to be 100% dependent and reliant on Russia and controlled by Russia, and then ends it by saying this is all to stop the colonization of Ukraine and to stop it from being dependent on the West. My God, man. The levels of irony. But the fascists were never meant to be morally consistent in making propaganda like this. It's just to flood the information space with as much gunk as possible to cover up the ears and mind of the readers, to make them look the other way when the atrocities start, to make them feel that, you know, putting the jackboot on the neck of the people that many of them used to be close to is perfectly acceptable and actually for their own good. That the Ukrainian people are bad and they must be beaten into submission if they are to heal and be truly good Russians. This is fascist propaganda. This is not an outlier of the type of content that is regularly pumped out by the Russian state media. This is the norm, and I wish the Western press would cover this more instead of just Russian government statements or statements deliberately designed for the West. Look at what the domestic press pumps out on a regular basis. The type of fascist propaganda that could easily justify in many of the war criminals going out here, doing war crimes on the daily, their atrocities against the local civilian population, which they're being told is bad to the bone, and by being Ukrainian, they are inherently Nazis. I wish stuff like this got more coverage.